Good afternoon. This is Cathy Graham with Payentry. Welcome to our webinar on employee files. We're going to talk today about a number of things, but let's get started. We still have a few people, I think, that will be joining us, but let's go ahead and start. Again, I'm Cathy Graham. I'm the VP of HR Services for Payentry here in Huntersville, North Carolina. Today, we're going to talk about managing your files. You have a ton of them. This picture shows you what you feel like you have, even though it's probably not that much, but it is an overwhelming issue sometimes. The questions we're going to answer today are why in the world do we keep these records in the first place? There are a number of answers to that. We're going to talk about who should have access to what files. That becomes an issue when somebody comes in and wants to take a file and you're not sure if they should have it or not. What should be kept in a separate file? What does the law say, and what does your company need to do? What are the requirements for storing files? How long do I have to keep them before I can destroy them? And can employees have access to their files? Okay, so first of all, why do we keep these records? Number one is to comply with federal, state, and local laws. That's always the case when you have an employment situation. We're always complying with one law or another. We're also looking to maintain current personal information on each employee, and then to be able to provide prove that benefit enrollments, their elections, and their decisions that they made are correct for deduction purposes. We're also going to collect documents related to employee performance for decisions about pay and jobs, and being able to go back in an audit situation and make sure that we could prove why we did what we did as far as those things go. Another thing is to want to stay organized. I mean, you could put these things all in a big stack on your desk, but if someone came in and wanted something, how in the world would you ever find it? Especially if it's an outside department like the Department of Labor, it would be very frustrating for them to have to wait and for you to have to find it. So we want to be organized. We want to be able to put our hands on something when we're asked for it. We want to be able to quickly respond to audit requests, and I don't know how many of you have had audits before, but auditors can make you pretty nervous. And so you want to be able to get to whatever they're looking for quickly. So first on our list for compliance issues, obviously we want to comply with the federal laws first and then the state and local laws. What records do you have to keep? So we know why we have to keep them. Now, what do you have to keep? When you're talking about selection, hiring, and employment records, you want to maintain job applications, resumes, the ads or the postings that you did, screening tools, interview notes, and references. Those can all be collected at the time of hiring. Records related to performance appraisals, training records, and positions held within your organization are important to keep. EEO-1 forms, if applicable, if you have more than 100 employees or you are a government contractor, there are certain requirements for keeping the gender of the person and the ethnic selection on file for reporting purposes. Again, what records do you have to keep? When it comes to payroll records, that's probably where most of your records come from. You have to keep timesheets and cards. If you have time clocks, like some of our clients do, those are just automatically kept electronically. But you're also going to want to keep basic employee data, the name, address, social security number, their gender, date of birth, occupation, job title, and classification. Those are things that would generally be kept in a payroll system like our own. compensation records, and the amounts and the dates that they were paid, and information on when your work week begins and ends. You may have 2 different work weeks within your organization, if some of the bigger companies do, but you have to establish when your work week begins and when does it end. You need to have the basis and the rate at which wages are paid. So if they're paid um, $14 an hour, that would be the basis and the rate. If it's a salaried amount, it's normally stated in a weekly or biweekly or even an annual rate. You need to keep track of the dates of payment and the pay period that it covers, the deduction information, any wage garnishment orders that have been attached, any overtime wages paid, and any fringe benefits paid. Then you have to keep track of the total wages paid each paid period. Now, all of this is in your payroll system. It's not something you need to print out and put in the employee file. It can be maintained electronically within the payroll system. Again, what records do we have to keep going forward? You have to keep the Form I-9. All employers are responsible for this. And copies of any documentation that you keep in accordance with that form, like their Social Security card or driver's license. It's up to you to do that. Then as far as employee benefit records, you need to keep their enrollment forms. You need to keep any change forms that happen during the year if they have a change in family status. Any beneficiary forms that might be completed in your office. And any forms related to employee inclusion in a retirement plan or a pension plan. Background check information is very important to keep because that could be something that comes back up later on. You have to keep tax records, the W-2s and the W-4s. Generally, those are kept in the payroll system, but some people may keep them in the accounting department. Attendance records, FMLA records, if you are large enough to have FMLA, unfortunate enough to have to comply with that. If you have more than 50 employees within a 75-mile radius of each other, then you have to comply with FMLA. You are also going to have to hang on to things related to disability claims, including information on accommodations. That could be disability from a workers' comp claim, or it could be a disability related to any other sort of a disability claim. You hang on to your drug test records. If you do that, any in-service medical testing that you do for particular plant employees like hearing or vision tests. If you're a healthcare facility, it might be immunizations or certain things that the employee is responsible for, testing that they're responsible for on an annual basis. Then any military leave records would need to be kept. And then, as I mentioned earlier, any workers' comp leave records would also be maintained. So now we know what we have to keep and why we have to keep it. So who has access to it? It's really pretty straightforward. There's a basic rule. Only those with a true need to know should have access. So if a supervisor comes in and wants to look at an employee file, they should only have access to the things about the employee, like their performance. They should not have access to any medical records or any disability paperwork, anything like that. If they don't have a true need to know, they should not have access. So what needs to be kept in a separate file? It's not a good idea, and yet it's absolutely against the rules sometimes to put certain things together. So in your employee file, you need a separate file for employee benefit information. Because if a supervisor goes into the file and pulls it out, they should not have any access to employee benefit information. So this way and an auditor when they come in would not need to look at that either. Any kind of medical records that you keep need to be in a separate file. Now, some people combine the employee benefit information with the medical records. In some cases, you can do that, but I don't suggest that you do that because in an audit situation, an auditor would be given more information than they really need to see. FMLA records need to be in a separate file. Workers' comp records, I-9 forms and documentation, disability records, and then I made a note here that I-9 forms, some companies will put all of those in the same file folder, alphabetically or in like a 3-ring binder. You can also store these electronically if you'd like to, but keep them separate from the rest of your files, because if an auditor comes in to do an I-9 audit, you don't want them getting access to all your other records because they don't have a need to know. All they need to do is audit I-9s, and it makes it a lot simpler, and they don't stumble across something that piques their attention in another file. So where do you keep these records? Well, sometimes our offices are not big enough to keep them all there. For paper storage, you really need a locked file cabinet with key access limited to certain individuals. I once did an audit, a HIPAA audit for a company. They had a huge room full of employee benefit files and medical files, and they had all locking file cabinets with keys, and they were all locked, but they had taped the keys to the side of the file cabinets so that anybody that walked in the room could get access to any of the file cabinets. So don't tape the keys on the side of your file cabinets. Make sure that only certain individuals know where the keys are and have access to them. In a separate drawer, you need to keep any files related to medical information. That's generally because that information could have some HIPAA protection if it has medical information, depending on where it came from and how it is accessed. Any disability files that relate to the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The law actually says for ADA files, they need to be kept in a separate file cabinet. So, but as long as you have them in a separate drawer or separate file, you should be fine. As far as electronic storage, because a lot of what we do nowadays is stored electronically, it has to be readily available for inspection or examination. You should not have to put in a work order to pull information from a file and it take 2 days to get back to it, because an auditor is not going to be very happy about that. You have to have strict security protocol in place for access, including passwords, firewalls, all of the things that you would want in place to protect things like your credit card information. So you would need to make sure that if you have an IT department, that the passwords for the accounts or the information that you're storing electronically are secured, and that those people, if they do have access, have been trained and have signed confidentiality agreements. And you must have a backup system in place. That's very key, because if you lose this information that you've stored electronically, there would be no way to go back and put it together, because you probably have shredded the paper file. So there has to be some sort of a backup system in place. Normally that's done every evening, and it is, or after you've uploaded files, there would be a backup system the same day so that you don't have to go back and scramble to put all this back together. So how long do you have to keep the records? Me, I don't throw anything away, but that's just me. There are requirements, and there's a chart here that tells you. For selection, hiring, and employment, those are the ones that you get at, like the applications and the resumes, you would have to keep those for 1 year after termination. If you have applications that you're getting that you did not solicit, you do not have to keep those because you didn't ask for them. But anything you ask for, you have to keep for at least a year if you hire them 1 year after termination. So back to the applications that you're getting or the resumes that you're getting, you got like 50 resumes and you only hired one person. After 1 year, you can destroy all of the um, resumes except for the person that you hired. On payroll records, it would be 3 years. And that would be anything that we talked about before, like W-2s and those things. A lot of companies keep them longer than that because if the employee is still working for you, it may be for some reason they want to access that information. I-9 forms, the law says 3 years after the hire date or 1 year after termination. Most companies keep things longer than that. But that's up to you because the law says if you don't have it after 3 years, they can't ask for it. Employee benefit files, uh, you need to keep those because any information related to employee benefits is governed by ERISA, which is a benefits law. And benefit files have to be kept for 6 years or longer, as long as they're relevant. So if the person is in a retirement plan, those files are kept pretty much forever and ever, at least for 6 years after the person is out of the plan. Background checks, you're required to keep those for 1 year. I would keep those longer because if there is a lawsuit, there may be an issue that you need to go back and prove that you used a background check information to make a decision. And so I would say this is the legal side of it, but I would keep them longer than that. FMLA records, 3 years. Disability records for a year. Drug test records for a year. But if you're governed by the Department of Transportation, because you're a trucking company or something of that nature, you have drivers, then you're going to need to keep them 5 years. And military leave files, there are no laws. So we look at that as being indefinite. There's no law that says how long you have to keep them. So every time I've mentioned one of these, I've said, but I keep them longer. It's because I'm always thinking someone is going to come back and want something. So if you have offsite storage or you have electronic filing and it's no big deal to keep them longer, then I would go ahead and do that. But if you have a purging policy as a company, which you should have a standard policy of how long you keep records, then I would just follow that. And then as long as you're consistent anytime in human resources, then you're fine. Can employees have access to their files? That's something if somebody wants to come in and see their file, yes, they do have access to them. They're allowed to see their files. They have to request them in advance. And normally the review would take place in the HR office. I say normally because there are a lot of state laws that vary. So you need to check your state for specific parameters. If you want to send me an email after this webinar is over, I will look up your state specific rules so that you know that. But generally you would, I think there is a law in California particularly where you would have to meet them halfway if they are working off site, or there's some really funky rules in California. So and also in Massachusetts and New York right now. So let me check it out for you if you have a concern about whether how that should happen. Okay, we've been brief today, but that is the end of our slide presentation. The chat is open for anyone who has a question. And I will and I see some familiar names there today, so if you have any questions, please, it's opened up for the couple of minutes for that. And if we don't have any chat questions, oh, here we go. Lori wants to know, does a terminated employee have access to their records? No, they do not. It would require court order for them to get it. because they're no longer an active employee? That's a very good question. So if they want to sue you, they're going to have to go to court to get their record. The files actually are the property of the employer, and you would never let an employee take the file out of your office, regardless if they're active or not. Celeste wants to know, does that include pay stubs as well? Celeste, if that is for a terminated employee, that's up to you to provide that to them or not. I would say if someone is a prior employee and wants a copy of their pay stub, that I would say that you should give it to them. You're not required by law to do it, because they should have kept those for themselves. So you're not legally required to provide anything to a terminated employee after they leave your company unless there is a court order. Those are very good questions. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, thank you for attending the webinar today. The next one that we're going to do is going to be talking about background screening and background checks and how careful you need to be about those and how to go about that. So that will be in June, and you can look forward to a notice about that. And I thank you for coming today. Please contact me after this is over if you have any other questions or things specific to your company you want to ask. Thank you very much.